Hello, PUC. I hope everybody's doing well. I am talking to you live from PUC World Headquarters in my office here. But fortunately, through Zoom technology, we can actually have great presentations like today. I'm going to introduce Professor Cramton to you. I know him from his work as a director on the ERCOT board. He's been there, I believe, since 2015, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
Yes, but in his day job, he is a professor of economics at the University of Maryland and as well as the University of Cologne. And in between those two things, he's also been the chief economist for 3 startups. He has designed and implemented electric and gas auctions in North America, South America, and Europe. He's advised 12 governments and co-invented the spectrum auction design used in Canada, Australia, and many European countries. That's a pretty big deal, guys. So it's a real honor to have him come speak to us. His background is an engineering degree from Cornell University and a PhD from Stanford. So definitely one of our smarter speakers. And so I thank you, Professor Crampton, for joining us today. My effort is to continue to always provide educational opportunities for staff, and I think this fits in fine. And I heard glowing reviews of this presentation from ERCOT, so we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you for coming today.
Good, thank you very much. It's my pleasure. The topic of the day is electricity markets in transition. And this is a very big thing that all of you are involved in. So I am not surprised that there is interest in this topic. It certainly fascinates me. And this is a topic that is not just happening in Texas, it's happening everywhere in the world. So the question that we're going to ask is, given that this electricity market transition is happening, how quickly will it happen? How much will it cost? And how will the answers to those questions depend upon the market rules that we have in place and the policies that are in place, for example, climate policy? And the answer we'll see is, today we aren't going to actually see the answers. Today I'm going to just quickly present what we're doing, which is creating a very powerful tool with which to answer those questions. And with that tool, then we can run any scenarios that people want to run in a particular energy market in terms of market rules or climate policy to determine the impact on the market in terms of the rate of the transition and the cost of the transition and the reliability impact on the markets and so on, all the things that you care a great deal about in your work. This is very much a joint effort. We've got a main internal team of 4, myself working with Emanuele, who's also on the phone. He's a PhD economist. David Malik, who is a PhD computer scientist. And Pat is working from Thailand. He's a PhD economist who's a professor in Thailand. Huge project. Huge effort. We'll just be able to scratch the surface today. My plan is to spend 45 minutes talking, and then while I'm talking, if some question comes up to you, then please feel free to enter it into the chat window. So you can click on chat and just enter any question that you may have. My plan is to actually address the questions at the end. So I'm going to leave 15 minutes of time at the end to be able to address those questions. So please just throughout enter them. We can also have questions. You can speak your questions, but let's wait until the end to do that for want of time. So this picture shows what was the largest battery in the world as of December 2017. It was built in 90 days in South Australia by Tesla. And in fact, Tesla promised to build it in 90 days or they wouldn't be paid anything for the battery. So it was completed within 90 days, and it just shows you the speed and power of these new technologies. The other technology that's displayed here is, of course, the wind production, and these windmills, they take longer to build, but Texas knows very well how important they can be. And these two are very much complements. So the wind, as you know, is intermittent, and the battery can arbitrage the cost time, which is very helpful in bringing reliability and flexibility. And that is a good glimpse of what the future looks like. This is what the past looks like. And it used to be that electricity was very simple and very boring. You look at how much load you have, and you would build enough coal plants to satisfy that load, plus some gas peakers to bring some flexibility, greater flexibility, so that you could handle the peaks and outages and so on more effectively. But that was it. And that's the way electricity worked for certainly all of my lifetime until recent years. But things are changing enormously, and they're changing quickly. And how effective that change is very much does depend on market rules and policy. And for me, it's a wonderful time to be alive, because this area of electricity market design has become so fascinating. And I suspect for all of you, the same is true, that here sitting at the PUC, you're in an ideal position to influence the future of Texans in a very positive way through good policy. And fortunately, I've studied electricity markets all over the world. I can report that so far, Texas is on course for having the best electricity market in the world, and I see no reason for that to change. And that is a very good thing, and all of you should be quite proud in what you're doing to make this happen in Texas. And the folks at ERCOT should be very proud as well. I should say as disclaimer, everything that I say today is my own view, not the views of ERCOT or the ERCOT board. So this is yesterday. But fortunately, the future has arrived, and it's arrived a little bit earlier to Texas than some other markets in the United States, but it's effectively arriving everywhere in the world. And that's very much a good thing. Here is a large solar farm in Central Texas as another example. Here's my car. It's a Tesla Model S 2020. It's fully autonomous. It has a range of 400 miles. It can add an extra 200 miles with a supercharge in about an hour. So it's an incredible innovation from the cars of yesterday. It has zero emissions. So this is really wonderful. It also has a huge battery. And this huge battery can be plugged to the grid. And right now, when it plugs to the grid, it charges at smart times, that is times when the electricity price is low. But in the future, it not only will be able to engage in smart charging, but it will engage in smart discharging when it's plugged in. And so it can support reliability and step in when the electricity price is very high and ERCOT's calling for more generation. So this is a glimpse of the future. And it's actually very important because when we look at emissions in the world, over half of the world's emissions are coming from electricity generation and transportation. And in order to address climate change with electricity, we need to use a lot of renewables. In order to address climate change in the transportation sector, we need to electrify, which makes electricity the cornerstone on which any attempts to address global warming will take place. So there's an example of a charging station, the supercharging station that I talked about. Now, when looking at market design, the first thing that I always look at is the objective. And in this case, our objective is reliable electricity at least cost. It can be broken down into two objectives. One is short-run efficiency, which is making the best use of the existing resources. And the second, which is much more difficult to accomplish, is long-run efficiency. Long-run efficiency means that the market is sending just the right price signals in order to induce the right investments in generation and in demand response. So we get the right mix of resources. That turns out to be the much more difficult thing to do, although short-run efficiency is quite challenging as well. And we have to constantly work to make sure that the market is as best as it can be, and constantly in a state of rapid innovation, which we find ourselves, where there's all new sorts of resources that are wanting to enter the market, new ways of participating on the demand side. The market needs to accommodate all these new things. So it's not a static, everything's always the same sort of deal. It rather is one in which we have to move very quickly to keep up with the pace of innovation on the technology side, which makes it very exciting. We have serious challenges. We have to balance supply and demand at every instant. There's physical constraints of the network that have to be satisfied. If we don't satisfy them, lines melt, equipment's destroyed, really bad stuff. There's shocks to supply, transmission lines fail, generators can have outages. So we have to deal with all those things. And then plus, as we add renewable resources, these resources are invariably intermittent, like wind and solar. And so we have to address the shocks that are coming from the weather and the time of day. And another challenge has been the absence of demand response. And this is something actually where Texas has had a distinct advantage, because Texas has a very large industrial load, and that industrial load is the first to respond to price. And so Texas sort of naturally has much more sophisticated demand side and much more response than the other markets, which has actually made it helpful. But Texas needs to also engage the retail consumers to respond to price as well. And that actually is beginning to happen as a result of retail choice. Another key component to the Texas market, which is much better than any of the other markets in the United States. Texas implemented retail choice much more effectively than anybody else. And in some places, like where I live in California, we don't have retail choice. I just have to go to the monopolist and get my electricity plan from them. And then the final challenge is climate policy. This is everywhere in the world, not just the United States, but everywhere in the world has a chaotic climate policy that makes investment in generating assets very difficult, and the operation of the electricity market much more difficult than it needs to be. So I'll come back to climate policy again later on. So we understand now, after a few decades of doing this, what a successful market design is. And the key component is getting the spot prices right. And this we do, this is best done as we do it in Texas with a day-ahead market in which the generation and the demand side express their preferences in a very rich way. And that enables ERCOT to do the optimization, to schedule the resources, so we can make plans for the next day. And it also establishes tentative quantities and prices, which are financially binding, but not physically binding, because we have to recognize that things change throughout the day, and we have to respond to those changes. And then throughout the day, parties are making adjustments in response to the shocks of supply and demand. And then in real time, ERCOT runs the bid-based security-strained economic dispatch, which then essentially determines physically who's supplying how much and what the prices are. This is a very powerful and effective spot market design that should be used everywhere in the world, but sadly its adoption has been very wide in the United States and a few other countries, but most countries are still behind in using more primitive spot markets than the nodal market that we have in Texas. Another critical component is that grows from a effective spot market is vibrant forward trading, which is necessary for the market participants to manage risk and to better support their long-run investments. So indeed, the vast majority of electricity is traded well before we even get to day ahead. And then a lot is traded day ahead, and then just a little bit is trading at real time. And that's actually a good thing. Everyone should be facing the real-time price on the margin, but that real-time price can be very volatile, as you know. And so it does make sense for the participants to engage in this forward contracting in order to put themselves in more balanced positions entering real time. They're still on the margin exposed to the real-time price, but most of the trade has occurred prior to real time, and that reduces their risk, reduces everyone's risk. So it's a win-win for all the market participants. Electricity market design matters. This is my first main point. And to give you an example of how much it can matter, I want to contrast the Texas market and the California market. In May, I moved from Washington, D.C. to Del Mar, California. And so I've had to get an electricity account here. Had I instead moved to Texas, this is what I would have done. I still would have gotten my Tesla and so switched to electric vehicle. And then I would look for a plan that made sense given that I've got this capability for smart charging. And so the best plan for me would certainly be one of the plans that where I pay a fixed monthly amount, in particular, and the two companies offer it, Evolve Energy and Griddy. I pay a fixed amount each month, $10, plus then 9 cents a kilowatt hour, which includes all the wholesale cost, about 3 cents of from the wholesale price of electricity, then plus 6 cents for distribution and transmission and other taxes and so on. So I'm paying about 9 cents a kilowatt hour if I'd moved to Texas. But instead, I moved to California, where I have no retail choice. The only provider is San Diego Gas and Electric. And they do have a number of plans. And fortunately, they have one plan that's best suited for electric vehicles. But look at the cost, $16 a month plus about 36 cents per kilowatt hours, 400% more than Texas. This large price difference is not because wholesale electricity is so expensive in California. In fact, in California, it's about the same 3 to 4 cents as we have in Texas. So the cost difference is because of bad market design and policy over many decades that have inflated the cost of electricity dramatically. One of the biggest failures that makes the California market unsustainable is what's called net metering. So in California, they have very good intentions, and there's a recognition that solar panels are really desirable to to reduce emissions. And so they motivated parties to put solar panels on the roof. And that motivation it came first as a subsidy, and then now the subsidy is effectively this net metering. Because what net metering is you pay that high variable cost, that 36 cents a kilowatt hour, you pay on your net consumption. And that means that when these solar panels are generating, they're getting, and you've got, let's say, enough solar power on average to cover your entire load, it means you don't pay the 36 cents for anything, which means that you're entirely free riding on those without the solar panels to cover the distribution and transmission charges, which are huge in California and becoming huger because this model is leading to stronger and stronger incentives to put solar panels on. The more people that put the solar panels on, the smaller the denominator over which we're allocating this large fixed cost of distribution and transmission. And so that's why it's completely unsustainable. You know, eventually this would go to infinity, right? As we get down to the last person that has to bear 100% of the fixed cost of transmission and distribution in California. So it's crazy. And worse, it's a big subsidy for the rich at the expense of the poor, because it's the rich that it can afford to spend $40,000 to put the solar panel on their roof and then get to enjoy essentially free electricity for the rest of time. So, you know, that's one of the problems. But the other problem that I emphasize in this article is the absence of retail choice and the fact that I can't have a plan that exposes me on the margin to the wholesale price. And that is something that needs to change, because we need to get more and more demand response. In Texas, this naturally happens as soon as people are motivated to and realize that they can actually save a lot of money by having a smart thermostat, having an electric vehicle, and then providing demand response services to ERCOT, and enjoy those savings. There's real retail plans now that give them that capability that motivates the incentive to make these investments, which are absolutely essential in our future world with all the high levels of renewables. When we look at the Texas market, and the left panel there shows load growth recently and anticipated. So from the current date for the next 5 years. And what we see is that the load growth is happening where the people live. That's not that surprising. And the middle panel shows where we're seeing retirements, which is basically where generation used to be. And a lot of that generation is old and is retiring. And so we're losing that generation capability where the people live, and drawing on new generation that's coming largely from West Texas. And so those transmission lines are very important. But what this means is, in our future world, electricity generation and load are going to be happening over much broader areas, which makes the nodal market all that more important in order to manage the congestion and send the right prices at the right time and induce the right investments in the right locations. So this is, you know, very, very important to integrate things like storage and demand response properly into the market. Climate policy matters. So far, the world has gotten a grade of F with respect to climate policy. We've been working on this for 30 years, and basically global emissions just grow year after year without stop. And this has to change if we're going to address climate change. And it has to change fairly quickly. So we really have to get off of coal very quickly, which is happening. But eventually we'll have to reduce our dependence on gas over the next decade or two. It's going to take a while. Now, when thinking about investments, one good metric is what's called the peaker net margin, which is basically looking at a hypothetical peaker plant and seeing how much profits that plant can earn from the energy market. And this is displayed for ERCOT for many years, from 2011 when the nodal market began up to the present. And what you see is that, and then in orange, so this line right here, about 90K is what you need to get for an economical peaker at the moment. And you can see in Texas that in fact, I'm going to get a little pointer. Okay, there we go. In fact, most years, you can see that Texas is, the generators are losing money from the wholesale price. But every once in a while, there'll be a year like 2011, which was a super nightmare in terms of reliability, and 2019 also was very challenging in terms of reliability. You know, both we had shortages occur, but very small amounts of loss in these periods in both 2011 and 2019, thanks to the very good market design. But these years, you're definitely losing money. That's not so bad. And in fact, the takeaway for me here is people love investing in Texas, and that's a really good thing. So even if these generators are losing money on average, that means it's a competitive marketplace. They're making their own entry decisions, and they must be making money somewhere else. And the reality is they are making money. They're making money on the retail side. So that's too is very competitive, but there's more scope for making money on the retail side. So that's where most of the dollars, the profits are currently in the ERCOT market. Looking at investments again, and especially with the lens of climate change on, this looks very good. This is the ERCOT queue, and we see there's lots of solar, lots of wind, lots of storage. So that's planned, and a little bit of gas, and that's basically it. So this is very good news for in terms of the way investments appear. When I look at all of the United States and aggregate it up for 2020, this is the planned entry, which again is very similar. Lots of wind, lots of solar, a little bit of gas. Again, very nice. When I look at retirements, it also looks very attractive. The coal is exiting, some old gas is exiting, and that's about it. And in fact, just a couple weeks ago, Vesta announced the retirement of on the order of 8 gigawatts of coal. So, the coal is going away fairly quickly. So this might all sound good news that climate change is addressed. We don't actually have to do anything. It's just happening by magic, but that's actually not the case. When we look at the US overall, this is the current mix of resources as of March. And as you can see, there's lots of gas, lots of coal, and then a little bit of other stuff. So we need the other stuff to dominate the gas and coal. So we need a lot of transformation here. And currently, this transformation is happening at a very slow pace, just about 4% a year of change. So it would take us a very long time to get to a point of very high renewable penetration at this rate. Fortunately, there's general awareness of this, and there's also general awareness that the best policy approach is carbon pricing. And FERC just a few weeks ago had a technical panel on carbon pricing. And I view that as very good news. And it was a wonderful panel. There was pretty much unanimous consent that carbon pricing made a lot of sense and was the direction that the US and other countries should move. Then 2 weeks later, FERC makes a landmark decision endorsing carbon pricing, at least modestly, in particular saying that states can have carbon price be a component of their rates. And so this is happening in real time now. So I don't know what, and we've got an election coming up in a few weeks. So things may change, but this support was bipartisan at FERC. One Democrat, there's just 3 right now. And so one Democrat and 1 Republican supported it, and 2 is enough for a 2/3 majority. So this I view as good news, because carbon pricing, what makes it so effective, especially in electricity, is 1, it's super easy to implement. ERCOT could implement carbon pricing in a month. It's just an adjustment to the settlement. None of the systems really need to change. It's just going to affect the settlement and impose various adders that reflect the carbon emissions of your type of generation, and that's all. So New York is already well underway to implementing it, and as I said, it's something that would be easy to do. It's also incredibly effective, and the reason for that is that carbon price is what gives the signal to market participants, all market participants, to take actions that reflect the cost of emissions. And that's a very powerful force. So yes, it's true that you could go in and mandate this behavior and that behavior and do all these things, give subsidies for solar, subsidies for wind, subsidies for this, that, the other thing. But doing all of those things, you would effectively, in order to address the billions of decisions that need to be made, you would need at least millions of different subsidies and mandates. And that's just not something that you can get right. So, really the future is going to be a carbon price. And it's just a question of how long it takes for the world to get there. I'm hoping that it will get there sooner rather than later, but we will see. From an investor's point of view, this is how the investors are thinking about climate policies, I'll say in a moment. So our question is, how does this transition depend on the market rules and policy? And for this, since this is happening over multiple decades, we obviously need a long-run model. It's all about long-run investments. It is not a steady state model. We're modeling a transition. And so we can't use your typical steady state analysis that's done in your typical long-run models. And third, we have to model the energy market. We can't just model, say, the long-term investment market, which in PJM is the capacity market. We don't have one. We have we have energy only. But modeling these long-term investment decisions is based on the profits that the resources earn from the energy and reserve markets. And to calculate those, we need to explicitly model the energy market, because they will depend upon the resource structure, how much wind we have, how much coal we have, how much gas, how much solar, how much storage. All that is what's needed in order to figure out what the profits are. And so for that reason, we're having to model the energy market, which makes this model very complicated. But in a nutshell, what we do is we model the entry and exit decisions of rational investors that are forward-looking. They have expectations about the future. And then the most profitable resources enter, the ones that are unprofitable exit. And we anticipate their cash flows throughout the life of their plant, which is somewhere between 15 and 45 years. And we are able to calculate any money they get from a capacity market, if there is a capacity market, their revenues in energy and reserve markets. And of course, we have to subtract the fixed and variable costs. The model is done when we found an approximate equilibrium. That is when the expectations of our forward-looking rational investors are consistent. So this is a very sophisticated model. It's a very powerful model. And the big question is, can we actually compute this model? The answer is we can. Which is amazing, that the computers and the algorithms are now so powerful that we can actually do this. So what makes what's hard computationally is the energy market, because this involves a lot of optimization. We're doing this model. Actually, right now we've implemented it for the PJM market, which is the largest market in the world. And we are modeling the individual resources. So the decisions are made at the individual unit level. So the day-ahead market is a very large mixed integer programming problem that ERCOT's solving every day, PJM's solving every day, and we have to solve every day that we model. And then during the day, we have to rerun it to solve the interday problem as things change. And then finally, we have to run the real-time dispatch to determine the economic dispatch on a 5-minute basis. So essentially, we have to go through and do everything that ERCOT does and PJM does. But instead of doing it for one day, we have to do it for every day of every year for all the years of our study period. And since our resources last about 40 years and our study period's about 40 years, we need to extend the analysis beyond so that the guys that enter, say, in the last year of our study period, they still get to properly estimate their rents in their profits in those future years. So we actually run this model for 90 years. And it's amazing. We are actually able to do this. There's lots of assumptions that we have to make. So our resource structure, we know what the current resource structure is. We know what the current market rules are. These things are going to change. We have to make an assumption about climate policy, which I'll talk about in a second. Decisions about the extent of price responsive demand, how the technologies evolve over these decades, so that the fuel prices, there's lots of assumptions, but we need to make them. Now, we do make a few assumptions to simplify our life. The first and most important is we assume that transmission constraints do not bind. And the reason for this is that in a long run model, to first order approximation, what happens with respect to transmission is you engage in planning and you anticipate where resources are going to be built, and you built the transmission to avoid persistent binding transmission constraints. So that's what Texas did when they built the CREZ lines out to the west, anticipating the wind from the west, supplying the load mostly in the east. And So we're essentially doing the same thing, that as the market evolves, this planning will take place, transmission will be built, and so the transmission constraints will bind on occasion, but when they do, it will be on occasion as a result of outages, as a result of shorter term phenomenon that we don't need to model. So that's our main simplifying assumption. The second is we're assuming that both the energy and capacity markets are competitive. And this is PJM, but PJM is also very competitive like Texas. So it's actually a very good assumption, except for when transmission constraints bind. And then there's the automatic mitigation to address market power. But one thing that we do include is these hockey stick bids for resources like peakers. When they get close to doing 100% of their capacity, then their supply offer goes up very steeply. And we do that because it's empirically how people tend to bid. It doesn't have a big impact. The market's that competitive. Climate policy, what do we do there? Well, the investors anticipate we model climate policy just with the carbon price path. And we assume that the investors anticipate the carbon price path over the life of their plant. Now, in practice, what do investors do? They actually do this. They have a carbon price that they're assuming, because if you're spending $1 billion in Texas or anywhere else, of first order importance is what is the explicit or implicit carbon price from whatever climate policy happens to be in place. And so Exxon or any generating company will, when they're making these investments in energy sector, will assume a carbon price. Now, there's lots of uncertainty about what that carbon price will be. In our model, we're assuming that the carbon price path is known, but then we can rerun our model with uncertainty and have that carbon price path be uncertain, but that's sort of a last step that we haven't yet done. So here's the model. It consists of 4 components. The first at the bottom there is the net load forecast, which involves estimating load on a 5-minute basis for the entire 100-year period. And it's not just the realization of load, which of course we have to do, but we also have to forecast it 1 hour ahead, 2 hours ahead, 3 hours ahead, and so on, because that's the information that the market participants have when they make their decisions. So that's sort of a key component that feeds into the energy market model, because it's this net load forecast that you're trying to, that you need to satisfy in order to balance supply and demand in real time and have reliable electricity. The energy market model is, as I discussed, it's the real time, it's the day ahead market followed by real time. It includes regulation, it basically includes everything that you have in the ERCOT model, almost. There's a few things that are simplified, but not much. The reality is this we can do about 1,000 years of PJM in one day on 22 high-end servers that are running in Finland, which is quite amazing that we can do that much. And we do that, we're able to do that because the computers are so powerful and the algorithms are so incredibly powerful now for solving these mixed integer programming problems. So that's really nice. But even still, if we were to run the capacity market model, we need about 80 million calls to this energy market model in order to do all the iterations to find this the equilibrium investment decisions over a multi-decade period. And so that would take hundreds of years, even with our 22 high-end servers and the latest technology. So we don't have that kind of time. So what do we do instead is we make, let's say, 10,000 runs of the energy market model. So 10,000 years with different resource structures. And that gives us a very rich data set from which then we can run the energy, we can do econometrics to create a very nice, powerful model that can estimate energy profits for different resource structures and different other different parameters, different fuel prices and so on. And so that's what actually gets called 80 million times, because this can be computed very, very quickly. And then finally, the capacity market model, which is the annual market where we do the investments, entry and exit on a yearly basis. And if there is a capacity market, as there is in PJM, then we can, we also run the capacity market and identify the capacity price as well. But we can, one of the scenarios that we're running is the energy only model of PJM, where we basically take out the energy market, the capacity market, and see if it can perform as energy only, which the answer is yes, of course it can, just like ERCOT can. All you need is a very good spot market and good forward contracting, and you'll be just fine. So those are the components. Now, I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed through the rest. I'm not going to talk about the particular details, but they are described: the load forecast, the energy market model, the difficulty of the computation here. And I should say that when we, so as this transition happens and we get more and more renewables, one reality is that you cannot live on 100% renewables unless you have a lot of storage and demand response. This shows, just as an example, this is on the bottom here is the July, the peak month in 2060. If we assume we have, starting in 2035, 15 gigawatts per year entering that are intermittent renewables. And 15 gigawatts is 10% of, ERCOT's about 150 gigawatts, so it's about 10% of peak. But anyway, if we do this for all these years, by 2060, we've got 3 times as much. We've got about 500 gigawatts of capacity at that point. And yet, in the peak month, notice that still these peaks are around 100 gigawatts, which means we basically need to service the peak. We have to have lots of something else. And this something else could be combined cycle gas. It could be storage. It could be demand response. In practice, it's going to be some combination. But it looks even more crazy to rely 100% on renewables if you look at the net load in the shoulder month, April. So here it is in April, and you can see that the net load is substantially negative by, peaking at around minus 100 gigawatts. That's a lot. So this is just completely ridiculous. You have to have something that can be flexibly respond, which is going to be storage, combined cycle, something, and demand response. So storage, last couple points before I get to the conclusion, storage is incredibly important in this future world. And that slide was intended to illustrate that. Storage is fundamentally different. It's not just this resource that sometimes it's a battery, sometimes it's a load, sometimes it's a generator. And so you basically model it as 2 things. No, you've got to model it as one thing that can do both, and it represents its marginal cost in a fundamentally different way. Its marginal cost is its opportunity cost. And so you need to do this in a different way, and we do this the way it should be done, which is fully integrated into the day-ahead energy market and the real-time market. So we directly optimize the batteries in the market, which is what we will have in ERCOT in the long run. That's certainly the plan. Price responsive demand, also critically important, as ERCOT knows so well, as Texas knows so well. That's been what's saved Texas during when we've had like 2019, where we have very little, very tiny reserve margin and huge fluctuations in wind. What saved the bacon is definitely the demand response. Largely coming from industrial load, but in the future it will come from load like me, guys with electric vehicles that are delighted to save some money on their electricity bill by providing this valuable service of arbitrage across time to the electricity market. So lots of things on the capacity market and lots of scenarios. Now my concluding slide, and then I'll take questions in the minutes that remain. So what we have here is a very powerful tool with which to understand the impact of market rules and policies, such as climate policy, on things that really matter: the pace of the transition, market efficiency, the cost to load, and of course, reliability of the system. These are important questions of today. They're going to be important questions for the next 10 years. And this is the sort of model that will help regulators, system operators, and market participants better understand how an electricity market can be this beautifully designed market that really accomplishes its goal: reliable electricity at least cost. And that is, so this is very much a tool to keep us on the path to achieving that goal in a long run, despite the many challenges that we face today. So with that, let me open it up for questions. So you mentioned earlier that ERCOT is currently working on enhancing its market design so that in real time, both energy and ancillary service can be co-optimized every 5 minutes using the ancillary service demand curves. I know today's competitive wholesale electricity market operate under the principle of supply and demand. While the ERCOT market design is not unique in this sense, what are the key elements of ERCOT's market design that help ERCOT reliably and efficiently integrate almost 23 gigawatts of wind and almost 2 gigawatts of solar generation? That's a very good question. And it is kind of amazing. And I have to say that the process to get to where we are has been very much an evolution. All the electricity markets in the world started out fundamentally flawed, very serious problems. And fortunately, there's been sort of leaders in presenting the problems quite visually, such as California. The California energy crisis in 2000, 2001 was extremely helpful in promoting the sort of innovations that we basically in Texas, we learned from California and then created a design that addressed the serious flaws in the California market. And so the key elements are exactly what I said. The real-time bid-based security-constrained economic dispatch with nodal pricing, the day-ahead market for scheduling and planning, and to put parties in more balanced positions stepping into the real-time market. So those two, both nodal markets, both very important in sending the right price signals. To make this work better, we need to co-optimize energy and reserve, both day-ahead. These are energy and reserves are tightly interlinked products, and the only way to do them effectively is to co-optimize them. So Texas has been co-optimizing energy and reserves in the day-ahead market ever since nodal began in 2011. we now are going to be co-optimizing energy and reserves in real time, beginning in 2024. So we're very much on that path. That was the big PUC decision last year, which was a very smart decision and putting us on a path to have one of the best markets. Now, the next step is going to be to integrate storage and demand response coming from distributed generating resources, which are the initiatives at ERCOT today, as you know. So at the PUC, you should be constantly pushing us and the market participants to get all that work done in order to revise the rules to accommodate fully storage, demand response, and the distributed generation. So that's very much, we have laser focus on those issues right now. The market participants are working together collaboratively and effectively. And we've seen this with the co-optimization in real time. We are seeing it in the look at storage and distributed generating resources as well. So those things are happening. They're extremely important. And that's probably the biggest thing as a regulator that the PUC can do, is make sure that those things stay on track. And that's, as a board member, that's certainly what I'm going to be doing. It's very important, but it's these things that enable us to have a electricity system that is can be as responsive as it needs to be when there's these large shocks. When we had the event in 2019, those weren't peak hours. They were high load hours, but they weren't peak hours. They were hours where the net load was at its peak. And it was at its peak because the wind just wasn't there. So that 20 gigawatts of wind was only producing about 2 gigawatts or even less. And so we needed to have a lot of response from everybody, from the generators, from the demand side, in order to limit that shortage event to just a few moments. And it worked quite effectively. And so that's really what's needed, is basically send the right price signals. If you send the right price signals, then the system will work. And everything that one does should be focused on does this market change? We're considering changing the rules. Does this market change, or introducing a regulation? Does this market rule or regulation, does it promote the efficiency objective? If it does, it's going to also promote the reliability objective. And that's the mission of ERCOT: reliable electricity at least cost. And that is the goal of the PUC. So our interests are aligned. There's certainly some issues, but we distributional issues about how much people are affected in different ways. But overall, it's pretty easy to keep track of this efficiency objective and the reliability objective. And so that's what I focus on. So the next question, so hopefully I answered the question. Has anyone studied how a carbon tax would impact bills? Yes, absolutely. So this is very well studied. First of all, I don't use the word tax, because tax, as you know, in Texas is a 4-letter word. And so I use it as a price. It should be carbon price, because it is a tax is a government intervention to generate revenue. That's not what this is. This is a price to influence behavior. In fact, the revenues that are generated from that price can be returned back to the customers. And so it's very easy. If you just return the carbon revenues back on a per capita basis, you would find that about 72% of Texans would immediately benefit from the carbon price. And in fact, the 72%, that's the 72% poorest people in Texas. The only people that would be hurt would be the very rich people. So it has, if implemented properly, it can be done very nicely. And so that it doesn't, harm people. Now it is going to harm particular groups. So it's going to definitely harm coal. So if you have a coal plant, then you will be hurt. No question about it. Initially, it doesn't hurt gas. If you've got an efficient combined cycle, you're still going to be on the margin, and the price is going to go up on the margin and fully compensate you. So an efficient combined cycle over the next 10 years is not going to be hurt. They're still going to be on the margin. In the long run, they would be hurt. And that's why you're getting strong support for a carbon price from most of the energy companies. Shell, Exxon are supporting a carbon price now because they recognize that what they would really like is having some coherent climate policy rather than what we have today. What do you think about connecting Western and Eastern grids to facilitate renewable transition? So this is actually a big issue on the US level, that the more we interconnect and more broadly, the more efficient the transition can be. Because as you know, with renewables, the best site for renewables is not necessarily where the load is. And so transmission becomes very much more important, and there's greater scope. And so the US government has done studies that showed that it's actually worthwhile to interconnect the East and the West. The study that was done actually excluded Texas, thinking Texas was an island, but of course there would be benefits of connecting Texas. But right now the world, quite frankly, is enjoying the fact that Texas is not regulated by FERC. That's a very positive thing. And and I'm sure everybody's hoping that that will continue, because we have been able in Texas to move in more innovative ways and with less animosity than in the other regions. Texas is dramatically different in that way. The market participants solve collaboratively the problems that we face, which is really nice. Let me stop here. I thank you very much. I am happy to talk with anybody further about these issues. And so feel free to send me an email if you have any questions. I'm sure I'm going to be interacting with folks at the PUC, either indirectly through my board position, that is through the public meetings, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them too. Not as an ERCOT board member, but as a academic working on the electricity transition. So with that, I thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and now get back to work. It's a very important work that you do. Thank you very much.